It was June 1972, inside the crowded International Hotel restaurant in Las Vegas, where more than 150 late-night guests filled every table. Laughter echoed, silverware clinked. Yet Elvis Presley noticed something no one else did. A young waiter, pale and weak, nearly collapsing as he carried a tray. What happened next stunned the entire room. Las Vegas, June 1972. The International Hotel pulsed with the kind of energy only this desert city could produce after midnight. The cabaret crowds had spilled out of lounges, and gamblers pressed deeper into the casino halls, while upstairs the restaurant glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Around 150 guests filled the space, their laughter rising above the soft clink of cutlery and the haze of cigarette smoke. It was the hour when excess and exhaustion mingled, when the show was over but the spectacle continued at the tables. At the center of it all sat Elvis Presley. He had finished another near sold-out performance in the adjoining showroom, every ticket gone, every eye that night locked on him under the lights. Still wearing the shimmer of his white stage suit, sequins catching the chandelier glow. He walked into the restaurant with a small entourage. People whispered as he passed, heads turned, forks froze mid-air. Yet Elvis, accustomed to being the gravitational pull in any room, barely noticed. He carried himself with a kind of quiet fatigue, sliding into a booth by the wall, trying for a moment of stillness after 2 hours of relentless applause. The waiters hurried between tables, balancing trays of steak platters, cocktails, and coffee refills. The International ran on speed and precision, ever let the guests wait, never let the hum of service falter. But even amid the din, Elvis's eyes wandered. He had a performer's instinct for scanning a crowd, sensing its rhythm, reading faces. Tonight, that instinct was still alive. A family from Chicago waved discreetly from across the room, their teenage son clutching a napkin, hoping for an autograph. A group of businessmen laughed too loudly at the bar, slapping backs and toasting their winnings. Elvis noticed it all, but his gaze lingered not on the wealthy or the eager fans. It drifted toward the servers, their crisp uniforms, their steady movements, the effort it took to keep a smile in the thick of the night. The king tapped a finger against his water glass, rhythm without melody. He wasn't just looking, he was waiting, watching, because in this crowded room, where every table seemed saturated with indulgence, one fragile figure was about to interrupt the performance. No one realized they were watching, and that's when the story truly began. Mid-script reflection. Have you ever sat in a room where everything looked perfect on the surface, yet your eyes caught the one person whose struggle was written quietly in their face? The International's restaurant buzzed with noise. Plates clattered, dice rolled in the distance, and the showgirls who had finished their sets slipped in for late dinners. The atmosphere was alive, but alive in a way that dulled awareness. Few noticed the young man weaving through the maze of tables, carrying more weight than his body could bear. Elvis did. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing past the sequins and the chatter, past the cigarette haze and the polished silverware. Something was about to break the rhythm of that room. And in a city built on spectacle, it would not be the flashing neon outside, but a single quiet struggle under the chandeliers. But amid the buzz of celebration, one fragile figure in uniform was about to change the night. His name was Daniel, just 22, hired only 3 weeks earlier. The International's restaurant demanded stamina, charm, and balance, and Daniel had all three in theory. But tonight, his body betrayed him. He had skipped breakfast, then lunch, stretching his paycheck to help his mother cover rent. Dinner never came, just coffee in the back hallway and a steady ache in his stomach. Tray in hand, he wove through the crowded aisles. On it balanced 2 martinis, 3 plates of prime rib, and a silver basket of bread. His arms shook under the weight, but pride pressed him forward. The restaurant was no place for weakness. To falter in front of gamblers and celebrities meant humiliation, maybe even the end of his job. At Elvis's table, conversation stilled, the king's eyes fixed on Daniel. Years of scanning audiences had trained him to read micro-expressions, the signs of someone about to faint under stage lights. Daniel's pallor told the same story. The tray tilted. Glass stems clinked, threatening to tumble. Guests at the nearest table laughed nervously, assuming the young man was simply clumsy. They had no idea he hadn't eaten in over 12 hours. A woman in sequins muttered about poor service. A man in a velvet jacket rolled his eyes. But Elvis didn't laugh. He leaned forward, sensing what was coming. Daniel's knees buckled. The martinis slid. Gasps rippled across the room. The silver basket teetered at the edge of the tray. For a split second, time fractured. The chandeliers glared brighter. The laughter choked into silence, and all eyes turned toward the collapsing figure in the black and white uniform. Pattern breaker moment. The arena of indulgence went dead silent. One server dropped a towel and lunged forward. Security stirred at the far end of the room, ready to intercept a scene. But they weren't trained for compassion, they were trained to remove problems quietly, to keep the guests from discomfort. Daniel's lips moved soundlessly. His eyes glazed. The tray tipped further. It seemed inevitable. Glass crashing, plates splintering. A young man sprawled on the carpet in disgrace, and in that fragile instant, the spotlight in the room shifted. Not to a performer on stage, but to the man in sequins sitting in the corner booth. Mid-script, reflection. How often do we miss the quiet battles of those serving us, assuming competence while they silently collapse under invisible weights? The tray wavered once more. Gasps sharpened. Silverware froze mid-air, and then, with the inevitability of a curtain about to fall, Daniel's knees finally gave way, just as his body sagged toward the floor. Elvis Presley rose from his chair. The moment froze like a photograph. Daniel's knees bent sharply, his tray angling downward, drinks trembling as if suspended mid-air. Around 150 late-night guests held their breath. Forks stopped. Dice rattled faintly from the casino floor below, the only sound daring to intrude. Then came the hush, swift, unnatural. The arena of indulgence went dead silent. Security had already started forward. 2 men in dark suits, trained to guard the hotel's reputation more than its staff, cut through the aisles. Their approach meant one thing: remove the disruption, spare the guests. To them, Daniel was no different than a dropped glass or an unruly patron, something to be swept away quickly, without spectacle. But the spectacle had already begun. Elvis Presley, seated in his corner booth, leaned forward. His entourage, Joe Esposito, Charlie Hadd, Jerry Sheeling watched tensely, waiting for his cue. They knew him well enough to recognize the look on his face. The man who had commanded arenas of 20,000 was now locked on a single fragile figure in a black and white uniform. Gasps spread across the room. A woman clutched her pearls. A man whispered, "Is he sick?" A teenager whispered, "That's Elvis, what's he gonna do?" The tension wasn't just about the waiter anymore. It was about the king of rock and roll, the icon sitting just steps away, and how he would respond. Daniel's tray dipped further. One glass toppled, spilling a dark streak of wine across a white tablecloth. Murmurs rose. Some guests laughed nervously, eager to dismiss discomfort. Others frowned, impatient with the interruption to their meal. The crowd was split between annoyance, pity, and an almost superstitious anticipation of what would happen next. Pattern, breaker moment. This was no longer dinner service. It was a stage, and the story had found its actor. Security's footsteps grew louder. They reached out, ready to grip Daniel by the arm, to drag him away before the room could see him collapse entirely. The young man swayed, lips pale, eyes darting with shame. He tried to steady himself, tried to whisper, "I'm fine," though his body betrayed him. In the corner booth, Elvis's hands pressed flat to the table. The decision hung in the air. Ignore it, let security carry the boy out, or rise, place himself in the center of the storm. Mid-script, reflection, in that instant. What would you have done? Protect your comfort, or step into someone else's crisis? The silence deepened. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker lower, amplifying the sharpness of the scene. Every guest, every server, every eye in the room turned toward Elvis. Some whispered his name. Others held their breath. Daniel's knees bent once more. Plates slid. The silver basket of bread tipped forward. The disaster felt seconds away. And then came the choice. All eyes fixed on the corner booth, waiting to see if Elvis Presley would remain seated doorstand and change the night forever. 3 quick strides. That's all it took. Before security could lay a hand on Daniel, Elvis Presley rose from his corner booth. Sequins caught the chandelier light as he moved across the carpet. The crowd gasped as if a spotlight had suddenly switched on. For a man used to commanding arenas, this was instinct. A stage had appeared, and the moment demanded him. The tray tilted sharply. A martini glass spun off, striking the floor with a sharp crack. But before the rest could fall, Elvis reached out, steadying the wobbling load with one firm hand. The silver basket tipped, then landed safely against his palm. A ripple of shock swept the room. Guests who seconds ago had laughed were now silent, staring at the king cradling a server's tray like a sacred relic. He lowered it gently to the nearest table. Then he turned, dropping to one knee beside the trembling young man. Daniel's face was pale, his breath shallow. Sweat beaded on his temple. Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him as if he were family. "Son," Elvis said softly, his southern drawl cutting clear through the silence, "when's the last time you ate?" The question rang louder than any reprimand, louder than the glass that had shattered. Guests leaned forward. Some felt tears rise before they could stop them. The hush of the restaurant grew heavier, weighted not by embarrassment but by awe. Security froze in place. One of the guards, unsure whether to step in or step back, looked to Elvis's entourage. Joe Esposito subtly lifted a handstand down. This wasn't their moment. Daniel tried to answer, but his lips trembled. The truth was too heavy. He whispered, almost inaudibly, "Yesterday, maybe." His voice cracked. His body swayed again. Elvis steadied him with both arms, pulling him upright with surprising gentleness. Baton-breaker line. The king of rock and roll was holding up a starving waiter. Not a microphone around them. Forks clinked softly as diners set utensils down. Ashamed of their earlier laughter, the crowd had turned from spectators to witnesses, caught in the gravity of compassion unfolding in real time. Elvis looked up, locking eyes with the chef at the kitchen door. "Bring me the biggest plate you got," he called firmly, voice steady but kind. "Not for me, for him." The room exhaled. Applause rippled from one corner, hesitant at first, then swelling as guests realized what had just taken place. The restaurant that had moments before been tense with potential humiliation now trembled with catharsis. Daniel, guided by Elvis's arm, was led to an empty chair at the booth. Elvis motioned for him to sit, ignoring the bewildered looks of staff and guests alike. He reached for a napkin, handed it to the boy, and gave a reassuring nod. Mid-dash, script reflection. How many of us would stop a meal, a conversation, an entire room simply to make sure someone else wasn't hungry? The chef, Marino, returned moments later, carrying a platter that seemed fit for royalty steak, potatoes, bread, steaming vegetables. Elvis gestured for it to be placed in front of Daniel. The young man's eyes filled with tears. He stammered something about not being worthy, about working, about trouble. Elvis silenced him with a gentle shake of the head. "Sit, eat." The crowd erupted again, not in laughter, not in gossip, but in applause. Some rose to their feet. Others dabbed eyes with napkins. The entire room had shifted, and as Daniel took his first bite, Elvis turned his gaze outward, ready to make the moment even bigger. Daniel sat trembling at the edge of the booth, napkin draped unevenly across his lap. The enormous platter steamed in front of him, filling the air with the aroma of roasted beef and buttered bread. For a moment he simply stared, unsure if he was allowed to eat while 150 eyes burned into him. Then Elvis leaned forward, giving a simple nod, and the boy lifted his fork. The first bite was small, shaky. He chewed slowly, as though afraid it would be taken away. But the moment the food touched his lips, something in the room changed. It wasn't just Daniel's hunger being fed, it was the conscience of the crowd. Guests who minutes earlier had whispered or scoffed now found themselves clapping, some softly, some with full force. Others, moved by a guilt they could not name, pulled bills from their wallets, tucking them discreetly into the hands of nearby servers, whispering, "Make sure it gets to him." Pattern breaker line. A restaurant built on spectacle had just become a sanctuary of compassion. Elvis remained seated beside Daniel, calm, almost protective. He waved off the staff who tried to intervene, insisting with a gesture that this meal continue undisturbed. His entourage watched with quiet pride. Charlie Hodge whispered, "That's him, man. That's Elvis." At a nearby table, a woman in sequins dabbed her eyes. "I thought he'd be untouchable," she murmured to her husband, "but he sees people," across the room. The teenage boy from Chicago clutched his napkin tighter, not for an autograph anymore, but to remember the lesson he'd just witnessed. The kitchen staff gathered near the door, whispering among themselves. Chef Marino shook his head, eyes moist. "I've cooked for presidents," he muttered, "but tonight I saw what it means to serve." Daniel ate steadily, each bite restoring color to his face. Elvis kept a hand on the back of his chair, anchoring him, grounding him. Guests began to lean into the moment, adding to the act in small but meaningful ways. A man in a velvet jacket, embarrassed by his earlier impatience, quietly covered Daniel's unpaid tab. A young couple stood and offered him their dessert untouched. The community that had begun the night as a crowd of strangers was slowly becoming something else in assembly, bound by compassion. Mid-script reflection. Can one person's courage to show kindness unlock compassion in others? Or do we simply need someone to remind us that we are capable of it? Applause swelled again, louder this time, rolling through the chandeliers like a tide. Daniel's fork trembled as he raised another bite. His tears fell freely now, dropping onto the napkin across his lap. Yet he kept eating, urged by Elvis's steady gaze. Guests began telling the story aloud, even as it happened. "Did you see what he did?" whispered one man to his wife. "He stopped everything." A woman near the bar nodded. "I'll never forget this." The International Hotel restaurant had become more than a dining room that night. It had become a stage where compassion performed louder than music, where applause was given not for a song but for a simple act of feeding the hungry. As Daniel finished the plate, pushing it back with trembling hands, the crowd erupted once more. Ovations swelled, rising higher, the kind usually reserved for the showroom stage. Elvis stood behind him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder, allowing the applause to wash over not himself, but the boy who had nearly fallen. And as the clapping faded into a reverent hush, everyone wondered, was this just a meal, or the start of something that would be remembered forever? When the night finally ebbed, guests drifted back toward the casino floor. But they carried more than memories of cocktails and chandeliers. They carried a story. In the decades that followed, staff at the International recalled that evening with almost sacred reverence. It was like the whole place turned into a church. One server later said, "But no sermon, no preacher, just one act of kindness." Daniel would never forget it. In interviews years later, he explained how Elvis had quietly done more than feed him. Within days, medical bills his family could not afford were mysteriously covered. An envelope arrived at his mother's doorstep, cash folded inside. No signature, but written across the flap in Elvis's unmistakable hand. "Take care of him." It was a gesture that went far beyond that single night. For Daniel, the moment shifted the course of his life. He stayed at the International for several more years, later working his way up to assistant manager. Each time a young hire stumbled or faltered, he remembered the hand that had steadied him. That night he said, "I learned leadership isn't about power. It's about noticing who's struggling when no one else does." Artifacts of the evening lingered too. In the kitchen, tucked behind a shelf where staff clocked in, a small brass plaque was installed in the late 70s. It read, "In this place, compassion served first." Many employees claimed Elvis himself had quietly funded its engraving, though no official record proved it. Still, it hung there, a daily reminder that service wasn't just about food, it was about humanity. Pattern-breaker line, for once. A casino famous for neon and noise was remembered for silence, the kind that follows when kindness takes command. Elvis never spoke publicly about the event. It was never turned into a headline or a press release. For him, it was simply a creed lived in real time, a private vow carried out in public light. Yet those who witnessed it passed the story along. Some told it in hushed tones to friends, others recorded it in personal journals. A few even called it the night the king served. And though Elvis would leave the stage only 5 years later, this small, unpublicized act remained etched not in gold records, but in the quiet testimonies of those who saw it happen. The chandeliers at the International eventually dimmed. The applause of that night faded into memory. Yet what remained was not the sparkle of sequins or the glow of neon, but the lesson hidden in a simple act. Greatness is measured not in spotlight, but in sights what we notice when others look away. Elvis could have ignored the moment. He could have left Daniel to collapse quietly, spared the crowd the discomfort, and returned to his meal untouched. Instead, he chose the harder path, to interrupt indulgence with compassion, to pause a room full of noise and fill it with silence that meant something. That night, he fed more than a body. He fed the idea that dignity belongs to everyone, whether seated at a booth or carrying trays between them. And in doing so, he reminded a crowd of strangers that humanity is not about grand gestures, is about noticing the unnoticed. Mid-script reflection. Who in your life might be quietly carrying more than they can bear, waiting for someone to see them? Because sometimes the most legendary acts don't happen under spotlights. They happen at dinner tables, in front of 150 people, when kindness changes everything. Stories like this remind us that the smallest gestures can change lives forever. If this night at the International touched you, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters. And tell us, when was the moment you witnessed compassion turn silence into something unforgettable?